The tension in the auditorium was impossible to ignore. It wasn't the kind that came from anger or protest, but the thick, silent kind that settles in when everyone knows something big is about to happen. Dozens of delegates, legal experts, students, and journalists had packed into the International Policy Forum in Geneva, each of them whispering about the unexpected panel that had just been added to the schedule. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the military leader turned head of state from Burkina Faso, had asked to share the stage with U.S. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett during a live session on international law and human rights enforcement. It sounded like a conversation, but nobody believed that. The energy in the room said this was something else. This wasn't about legal theory, it was personal, political, and likely meant to be public. At the front of the hall, two chairs stood waiting. The flags behind them, the United Nations, Burkina Faso, and the United States, swayed slightly under the cold air. Jasmine Crockett sat quietly, her posture straight, her hands resting gently on her lap. She didn't look tense, she didn't look nervous, she looked like someone who had been in tougher rooms before. Her calm wasn't the kind that came from arrogance, it came from years of courtroom pressure, from walking into spaces where people had already decided who she was, and then calmly proving them wrong. Just a few feet away, Ibrahim Traoré entered, with a firm stride, head held high, the way generals walk when they're used to people listening before they speak. He nodded once to the room, then to Crockett, and said, from the outside, it looked respectful. But even through the silence, it was clear that his presence was more than formality. For weeks, his team had quietly hinted that this would be his chance to challenge what they called Western legal arrogance. Traoré, a man who had built power through military control and constitutional changes, believed in strength visible, loud, dominant. Crockett, on the other hand, had built hers through something slower and harder to spot: preparation. The world watching from their screens didn't know what was coming, but inside the hall, people started leaning forward. Cameramen adjusted their angles. Interpreters tightened their headsets. It was like a courtroom without walls, a political debate without scripts. People didn't come to see a panel, they came to see a moment. One man believed he would crush his opponent with experience and dominance. The other sat quietly, ready to let facts speak louder than ego. Nobody knew it yet, but what was about to happen would echo far beyond that room. What started as a planned takedown would turn into something else entirely: a quiet but unstoppable reminder that legal knowledge, when sharp and steady, doesn't need volume to win. It only needs someone brave enough to carry it into the fire and still remain calm when the flames rise. It didn't take long for the tone to shift. The moderator had barely finished his opening remarks when Captain Ibrahim Traoré leaned into the microphone, his voice calm but heavy with certainty. He spoke slowly, like a teacher explaining a lesson he'd taught 100 times. Before we discuss international enforcement, he began, we must admit that some voices at this table speak from theory, not lived law. He didn't say her name, but everyone knew who he meant. The tension in the room sharpened, eyes moving to Crockett. She didn't flinch, her face stayed steady, her fingers still resting on her folder. Traoré continued, pointing out what he called external interference in African legal systems. He criticized the U.S. record on human rights and accused Western politicians of pretending to understand governance in countries they couldn't relate to. Some of us, he said, have held real power in real conflict where courtrooms don't fix everything. It wasn't just a disagreement. He was questioning her experience, her credibility. He framed her as a voice from a safe country, far from the real struggles of fragile governments and post-colonial justice. It was bold, it was direct, and it was clear he believed he had the upper hand. Crockett nodded slightly, then answered with controlled clarity. She reminded him that her career wasn't built in air-conditioned offices or political photo ops, but in courtrooms where people begged for justice against systems that crushed them. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't defend herself emotionally. She just laid out the facts about civil rights, about the law, about the people behind those laws who often got forgotten. Her words were clean, measured, but Traoré didn't back off. Instead, he raised the stakes. He started quoting legal articles from memory, obscure ones, the kind meant to trip someone up. Then he turned to her and asked if she was aware of certain regional court rulings that, according to him, made her entire argument invalid. It was the kind of move that worked when the other person wasn't ready, a trap dressed up as a test. And he asked it with the same smile he gave reporters when he shut down their questions back home. He believed this moment would expose her, that she'd stutter, misstep, or freeze. that she'd blink and show weakness. And for a second, the room leaned in. Was this where the cracks would show? But she didn't blink. She looked at him, calm as ever, and replied, "Yes, I've read those cases. And I've also read the ones your staff left out." You could feel it then, just the smallest ripple, like the air changed. The power he thought he held started to shift, and while he tried to keep control of the conversation, something had already started slipping. His words got sharper, his tone a little tighter. He was no longer explaining. He was trying to win. What he didn't realize was that Crockett had already done her homework, not just on international law, but on him, his rulings, his contradictions, even the moments his legal statements had been quietly corrected by his own courts. What looked like a strong position was starting to show cracks. He just didn't see it yet. It started with a single sentence. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward just slightly, her voice still soft, but with a sharpness that cut through the quiet. "Captain Traoré," she said, looking him straight in the eye, "you just cited Article 34 of the African Charter, but that article was repealed in the 2020 to reform your reform." The words hung in the air like a sudden drop in pressure. A few people in the audience blinked, unsure if they'd heard right. Traoré blinked too, not because he didn't understand he did, but because he hadn't expected her to. For the first time, the certainty in his posture shifted, slight, barely visible, but real. Crockett didn't pause. She calmly listed 3 rulings that directly contradicted the examples he had thrown at her minutes earlier. She didn't just quote the rulings, she explained how they were used in misleading ways by his administration to justify tighter controls over public dissent. She even named the judges. Her tone never changed. She never raised her voice. But every word hit with precision. The people in the room, especially the legal observers, started scribbling faster. This wasn't just a response, it was a full reversal, and it was happening live. Traoré interrupted, trying to steer things back in his direction. "Congresswoman," he said, forcing a smile, "you're quoting decisions that were heavily criticized, many by international bodies." Crockett nodded politely, then pulled a printed page from her folder and placed it in front of her. "You mean this report?" she asked, holding it up just enough for the cameras to catch the logo of the African Court on Human and People's Rights. "The same body you quoted in your opening remarks praised these rulings last year. I'd be happy to read their exact statement if time permits." He didn't respond. His silence wasn't because he had nothing to say, it was because he knew, in that moment, that saying anything would only make things worse. He looked to the moderator, perhaps hoping to move on, but the moderator simply nodded for her to continue, and she did, calm, steady, exposing one contradiction after another, not with attitude, but with receipts. She referenced dates, decisions, internal memos from legal reviews, and even a quote from one of Traoré's advisors, who had once admitted that parts of their constitutional update were rushed under pressure. People weren't just watching a debate anymore. They were watching something fold in real time. What started as a display of dominance from a seasoned leader was now being unraveled, point by point, by someone he thought he could corner. Crockett had turned the stage into a courtroom, without raising her voice or breaking rhythm, and Traoré, once confident, once in control, was now reacting, defending, grasping for control that was already gone. The shift was complete. Power had moved, and the people in the room knew it. This wasn't a back and forth anymore. It was a takedown in slow motion, won back not by ego, but by evidence. When the session ended, the applause didn't burst out all at once. It started quietly, a few hands clapping from the back row, then moved across the room like a slow wave. Captain Traoré remained seated for a moment, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, his fingers locked tightly together. The man who had walked in with the confidence of a head of state now looked smaller, not because he had lost his title, but because he had lost control of the moment. Jasmine Crockett, on the other hand, didn't smile or soak in the attention. She quietly gathered her notes, nodded to the moderator, and walked off the stage like someone leaving a courtroom where the verdict had already been written. Outside the auditorium, news alerts were already buzzing. Clips of her calm takedown were flooding social media. One video where she corrected Traoré's legal reference, using his own country's court ruling, had hit 1 million views before she even stepped outside. Reporters scrambled to get her on camera, but she said little. There was nothing more to prove. The work had already been done on stage. Commentators across platforms called it one of the most important moments of the entire forum. Law professors were tweeting quotes from her remarks. Students shared reactions saying they had never seen someone handle political pressure With that much poise and precision. By the next morning, the headlines told the story plainly. Crockett outclasses Traoré in live legal debate, knowledge over power, when facts speak louder than flags. On university campuses in the US, South Africa, and the UK, her exchange with Traoré was already being added to digital lecture lists. One international law professor at the University of Ghana wrote, "We are assigning her debate as required viewing. This is what real constitutional understanding looks like under pressure." Invitations poured in from legal panels, human rights forums, and even government reform groups asking her to speak. Her name wasn't trending just for the moment, it was being remembered for what it meant. As for Captain Traoré, things got quiet. His press team issued a short statement calling the panel productive and complex, but it didn't change the footage now spreading across every screen. For years, he had used his position to outtalk and overpower his critics. This time, he had met someone who didn't just talk back but did it with facts he wasn't ready for. The message was clear. Power isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about knowing what you're talking about when it matters most. And Crockett had done just that, proving that even in front of the world, calm knowledge could silence the strongest title.